everyone! Today I'll be building a Zlant 40% mechanical keyboard kit in the color Milk bought from 1UP Keyboards. I'll also be sharing how I made a custom keycap set to match. When opening up the kit, I noticed that it came with stickers, the PCB, rubber feet, the individual case layers, the FR4 plate, and the hardware needed to assemble the keyboard. I'm going to go ahead and get started by removing the protective film on each of the acrylic layers. I grabbed the vinyl weeding tool, which I'll actually be using pretty often during this build, and I use it to help me pull off the protective layers carefully. In case you haven't heard of this keyboard kit, the Zlant is a uniform, staggered 40% keyboard designed to be compact like an ortholinear, but without having to deal with the learning curve of using an ortholinear layout. It features a high-profile acrylic case and has everything needed to assemble it, not including tools, switches, a stabilizer, or keycaps. After removing all the protective film, I stacked all the layers up to see what the case looked like. Using the standoffs and screws, I went ahead and assembled it to get that portion of the process out of the way. I also placed the plate inside without installing it just yet to test the fit. Unfortunately, I placed it upside down and did not notice, so please disregard this as I assemble the case. The placement is not important right now since it's not being attached to the case just yet. The case is now assembled, and here's how it looks. 1UP Keyboards describe the color of this case to be milk white, and it's the perfect color to complement the keycap set I plan on working on for this build. It was easy to assemble, and seeing the case in person has gotten me really excited to proceed with this build. Next, I'll need to work on the PCB, so I put down my rose pink American Haptics work mat. I took out the PCB from the packaging, then plugged it in so that I could test it and make sure everything was working correctly. I brought out my pink fine tip tweezers from Stationery Stash and went along the back of the PCB, testing each key. The PCB is in good working order, so next I'll be installing the single 2-unit stabilizer for the spacebar. This 2-unit stabilizer is from my Durock V2 stab kit sent to me from agileshop.co for my last build. I had one extra set of stab housings left, so I'm glad I was able to use it for this keyboard kit and not let it go to waste. If you want to check this kit out, I'll leave a link to it down below, and you can use my code MOCHI for 5% off of your order on agileshop.co. Again, these stabilizers are already pre-clipped, so I'll just be lubing the housings and stems with Krytox 205G0 in a Kinetic Labs palette with a brush from Agile. I'll be lubing the wires with my grease syringe kit later as usual, so I went ahead and assembled it as well. Now that the stabilizer is good to go, it's time to install it onto the PCB. I brought out the washers and screws that I needed and took out my WowStick electric screwdriver. This is the only stabilizer this build needs, so this portion of the build went by super quick. For the wires, I brought out my stabilizer grease syringe kit from the Keycaps company. Don't forget that you can get 5% off of this kit by using my code MOCHI. I use a stem holder to move the sliders up and down after applying the grease to help spread it around. The stabilizer is now done. I know the 2-unit spacebar was optional for this PCB, but I love how it looks and feels. For switches, I'm going with Penguin switches sent to me from Kinetic Labs. These tactile switches are actually some of my favorite switches, and the colors are also perfect for this build as well. Kinetic Labs offers these in both lubed and unlubed versions, and while these are the version that's already pre-lubed, I went ahead and lubed them again anyway with Kinetic Labs Carbon GS2 Lube. I grabbed the plate for this build and added my switches to it. The total number of switches needed is 47. I found that these fit the plate snugly, as some plates for some keyboards have larger openings and the switches can sometimes fall out while I work on the build prior to soldering. I did skip the spacebar and the 2 keys on the left and right of it for now, because the openings are too large for the switch to sit without falling out. I turned the plate over, exposing the back of the switches, and carefully placed the PCB on top. I did have to trim the legs off of 2 switches in the center off camera because of the way this PCB was built. There are actually no holes for the legs to go through, so this was my fix for that issue. Now that the PCB sandwich is put together, I went ahead and added the last 3 switches. I also added a few keycaps to test how the stabilizer feels, and just to make sure I had the switches in the correct slots. Everything was good to go for the PCB, so the next steps will be to solder everything. Before I begin soldering in the switches, I put on my respirator and safety goggles. Again, this build uses only 47 switches, so it was pretty simple to do and didn't take very long at all. After I finished, I plugged it in to test it out and make sure that all the switches were working. I always make sure to do this before I move on to anything else because I wouldn't want to discover a non-functioning key after I've added my keycaps. I moved back to my regular build space, turned the keyboard case over, and began to add the standoffs to screw the PCB into. The PCB fits right into the case, and at this point, this keyboard is now ready for keycaps. So far, I've had a lot of fun working on this build, and I'm definitely enjoying the process. With what I plan to do for this keyboard, everything up until this point has been the easy part. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I'll be making a custom keycap set here at home, and the process for that has proven to be difficult and much more time consuming. I actually have been in the process of designing this keycap set for a few months, but as soon as I ordered this keyboard kit, I began finalizing all of the files I needed to make the icons required for each keycap. My inspiration for this keycap is Sylveon, which is my favorite Pokémon. I was also inspired by sets like Astrolokeys and Magic Girl because I've always loved the novelties and the overall aesthetic for both of those keycap sets. They both also happen to feature a DSA profile, which is my favorite keycap profile. 1UP Keyboards also posted this product image for the Zlant featuring DSA Magic Girl, and I love the key placement so much that I decided to base my final key placement on that image. KBDFANS was kind enough to sponsor the blank DSA keycaps for this build, and they have such a great variety of different colors available, including colors that match Sylveon's color palette perfectly. Unfortunately, I don't have access to any tools or resources to create real dye sublimated keycaps, so I decided to use my Cricut Maker and vinyl for the designs and legends. Through this process, I truly learned how tedious this method is, and it requires a lot of time and patience to do. At first, I had a completely different set of icons designed for this keyboard, but after testing out a few cuts with some scrap vinyl, I learned that I needed to simplify many of the designs. The reason for this is because the Cricut did not do the best job cutting out extremely detailed icons. In the end, I decided to go with larger legends, but I hope to make 3D renders of my original set because I worked really hard on it. After finally dialing down the settings needed for these Cricut cuts, I brought out my StarCraft HD permanent vinyl that I purchased from mycraftsource.com. I cut out several copies of each icon just in case. I also designed a Sylveon sticker for the back of the case, so I cut out the necessary pieces for it at the same time. I'll actually be applying that first, so after finishing with the Cricut, I went back to my build space and used the vinyl weeding tool from earlier to start the process. This video is about the keyboard build itself, so I won't go into detail about the process for this, but I used clear contact paper from the dollar store to help me apply the Sylveon sticker, color by color. I also used a wedge tool and a scrap collector that came with the weeding tool. This final toolkit is actually really helpful, so if you're interested in doing something like this, I'll leave a link to the kit down below. This is the first project I've used this kit for, and it's honestly one of the best purchases I've made for this type of craft. The Sylveon sticker is now done, and while the keyboard is still turned over, I went ahead and added the rubber feet as well. Next will be the hardest and most time-consuming part for the entire build, creating the keycaps. I applied the designs the same way I applied the Sylveon sticker and took advantage of the new wedge tool and contact paper to help me out. While I'm at this point, I want to mention that this is the first time ever that I'll be applying vinyl to PBT keycaps, so unfortunately I don't know how well these will stick over time. I already know that this board will be mainly used for display, and while I aim to have all of my keyboards fully functioning, this keyboard may not be used very often in order to preserve the designs. As a collector of keyboards though, I honestly don't mind, but I just want anyone who's interested in this type of process to know that it may not be permanent and will require some extra care to preserve. Again, this process is extremely tedious. It took me many hours and a steady hand to get it done. At the end though, after seeing the results and seeing my designs on the actual keycaps, I'm extremely satisfied with how it looks, and I do not regret it at all. It came out exactly how I envisioned, and I'm already thinking about the next keycap set I want to create. Finally, it's time to add the keycaps to the keyboard. However, while working on the keycaps, I decided that I wanted to add one more layer to the Sylveon sticker on the back. I cut out some white vinyl and added it to make it feel a little more complete. After finishing that up, I started to add all of my keycaps, being careful not to accidentally pull up any of the vinyl. One thing I noticed about this kit from 1UP Keyboards is that it unfortunately is having some tolerance issues. I will reach out to 1UP Keyboards about this, but the left and right sides of the case is cut extremely close to where the keycap edge is supposed to sit, and because of this, the very first key on the top row is unusable. If I press the key down, it does not come back up. Like I said, this keyboard will be mainly on display, so this is not really a huge issue for me, but I definitely think this issue needs to be looked at because most enthusiasts will be using the keyboard for its intended purpose. Hopefully I can get the case replaced or find a workaround. Aside from that, I'm really loving how everything looks so far. I created a few extra novelty keycaps, so I grabbed this layered acrylic macro pad to add them to. This macro pad features salmon tactile switches, also from Kinetic Labs. Overall, disregarding the tolerance issue on the case, I am extremely happy with this Zlant 40% mechanical keyboard build. There's something about seeing your own designs on a keycap set that I can't describe, but it's very inspiring and has given me a lot of ideas for builds I want to work on this year. Currently, 1UP Keyboards does not have a build guide up for this kit, so if you are new to this hobby and not sure how to assemble this type of keyboard case, you may have a few questions during the process. Fortunately, there aren't a lot of parts involved, so I do think it's something that you can figure out on your own. The build process can also be especially easy if you aren't trying to create keycaps at home like me, and with this being a 40% keyboard, you have less to solder, making it a good practice kit if you want to learn how to build a keyboard that requires soldering. At the time of filming this video, the Zlant keyboard kit is in stock at 1UP Keyboards for $95 USD. You can also buy the PCB separately. I'll be making a list down below and linking all of the items I used in this build, including the blank keycaps and vinyl, so if you're interested in any of the items you've seen in today's build, you can check it out. If you like this build and want to see more future videos like this, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I have 2 other Pokemon themed keyboards coming up soon and a few review videos, and I can't wait to share. Thank you again to KBDFANS for sponsoring the keycaps that made this build possible, and thank you all for watching.